were soldiers of the Queen. That was Queen Victoria. And she was a good queen, though, the old Queen Victoria. And they were going away to, they were going down to the pier, like the Brummelaw in Glasgow, to embark for South Africa. I mind of that, eh?
October 1899, Britain went off to war to beat the Boers and secure South Africa for the Empire. There were polo sticks and crates of champagne in the hold. They thought it would be over by Christmas.
Soldiers of the Queen. No, I don't think they were hollow words at all. We revered the royalty in those days, which is sadly absent at the present time. And I think a number of them thought that they were really fighting for the Queen and the Empire.
The Boer War took the world into the 20th century and taught Britain a resounding lesson. The greatest empire ever needed nearly 3 years to beat a Boer army smaller than the population of Brighton. It became the first modern conflict, a guerrilla war of scorched earth, concentration camps. Blacks were both victims and protagonists, and were condemned by the war to nearly 100 years of oppression. It has cast a long shadow across the century. The Boer War was dominated by the land over which it was fought, a war which began with a simple, seemingly innocent aim.
It's about freedom, nothing else. It's not about hating anyone. You just want your place in the sun. You want your rights. That's all it's about.
Kent gij dat volk vol heldenmoed en toch zo lang gekneld?
In 1836, hundreds of farmers, or Boers, trekked from the British Cape Colony deep into South Africa. Of mostly Dutch descent, devout and determined, they sought new lands to settle and farm, as far from British rule as possible. Boer trekkers climbed a hill in Natal they called Spion Kop, Lookout Hill. They gazed across fertile country, believing they had an absolute right to it, as do their descendants.
Toe was hier nie swart stamme hier in hierdie land nie. Die swart stamme, die
There were no black tribes then. The black tribes, Zulus and others, moved down from the north. It's in the history books. There were no tribes. Any land we got in Natal was lawfully bought from the Zulu people. We never annexed any land. People got land, or farms, which were empty.
But somebody was there first.
This is our land, the land of the black people. The Boers came and found blacks here. And the English came and found blacks here. This world belongs to us blacks.
The Boers did not agree. On the 16th of December 1838, 12,000 Zulus attacked 470 Boers at Blood River. The Boers formed their wagons into a defensive ring, commemorated in this bronze replica. The Boers had guns and cannon. The Zulus had spears and shields. That day, the Boers killed 3,000 Zulus.
I think that the idea of the Boers as a people was born at the Battle of Blood River. We say that God was with us at the Battle of Blood River. We prayed and said, "You must help us, because we will then dedicate this victory to you."
The Boer victory at Blood River became the foundation stone of their belief not only in God, but in themselves as the natural rulers of the land and of its black peoples.
The Boers saw us blacks as stupid people. We were not meant to own land. That is why they took the land from us. The Boers considered us as fools.
The Great Trek had been partly triggered by Britain abolishing slavery in its territories, including the Cape Colony. The Boers were determined to keep their slaves. As they took more land, their labour force grew. They paid the blacks a pittance, or just provided food, shelter, and sometimes alcohol. In the 1850s, the Boers founded their own republics, the Transvaal and Orange Free State. But this brought conflict with Britain. South Africa was of key strategic importance on the sea route to India, a vital piece in the imperial jigsaw.
If you were to take any school maps at that time, you'd find the predominant colour there was red, a pinkish red really, and that covered places like India, Canada, Australia, and we were extending our powers all the time, but we were, what should I say, it was a kind of beneficent theft.
The Transvaal had briefly been a British colony, but broke free after the Boers won a short war against Britain in 1881. So this was unfinished business. Driving British ambitions in Africa was Cecil Rhodes. As Prime Minister of the Cape Colony, he had grand schemes for a modern empire. He planned to build a railway from the Cape to Cairo and to control the lands and their wealth between. The Transvaal and Orange Free State were of little interest as long as they just produced sheep and corn. But the discovery of gold changed everything. The Transvaal became the richest and potentially most powerful state in southern Africa. Britain now saw it as a political threat and an economic resource ripe for exploitation.
Gold. Gold. They found gold in our country. That's what they were after, the gluttons.
In the British Cape Colony, wealthier and educated blacks who owned land had the right to vote. Many saw Britain as likelier than the Boers to extend their rights. But in the Boer Republics, blacks weren't even allowed to walk on the pavement.
The Boers wanted us to work for them. They wanted to turn us into their slaves. They just made us suffer. They only wanted us to work. They made us suffer from our labors, forgetting that we are human beings too.
The president of the Transvaal was Paul Kruger, veteran of the Great Trek. He believed God had put blacks on earth to serve the Boers. Blacks did not need political rights. But what about the 100,000 white English and Europeans, drawn by gold to the Transvaal? Their labours had turned Johannesburg into a rich, cosmopolitan city. They paid their taxes, but had no vote.
My father said they should let them vote. They can't let them pay all the rates and taxes and not vote. But old Paul Kruger was afraid they'd vote him out of office. So he didn't give them the vote.
Johannesburg, as it now is, was built by us. Yet you pass iniquitous laws denying us the ordinary rights of citizenship.
Mr. President, we are here now seeking redress by constitutional methods. But if you persist in your attitude of blank refusal, you try us beyond endurance.
Johannes Paul Kruger is my name. Johannesburg is my own town. And I feel towards it like a father whose daughter has been debauched by rogues and thieves. The interview is at an end.
Cecil Rhodes, as usual, had a plan. Nothing less than to take the Transvaal by force. By the end of December 1895, he had 600 men led by his swashbuckling sidekick, Dr. Leander Starr Jameson. And in London, he had the ever-so-secret blessing of the British Colonial Secretary himself, Joseph Chamberlain. But Kruger knew about the Jameson raid in advance and waited till it had set off before striking.
Message over the wires, Mr. President. Jameson has started. He's marching towards the border.
I have my white horse brought to the door. You'll find it ready saddled.
Paul, is there danger?
I'll be back in a few days. Fetch my boots.
If you want to kill a tortoise, Kruger said, you must wait until it puts its head out. Jameson was ambushed and never reached Johannesburg. He lost 65 men and was led off weeping to prison. It became an international scandal. London pretended the Jameson raid was a rogue operation, but the Boers were not fooled. They used their gold to purchase an arsenal of the latest weapons from Europe. Krupp field guns and Mauser rifles from Germany. Creusot siege guns from France. In June 1899, peace talks failed. Kruger felt increasingly threatened, but refused to compromise his country's independence. And Britain's negotiator with Kruger wouldn't have accepted a compromise anyway. Sir Alfred Milner wanted the Transvaal wrested away from stubborn conservative Boers like Kruger and placed firmly within the modern British Empire. With British troops at his border, Kruger decided to strike first.
President
Kruger knew how powerful the English were. He said, "You do not want voting rights, you want my country. That is what the war was all about. They wanted our land.
On the 11th of October 1899, the Boers declared war on Great Britain and promptly besieged the towns of Mafeking, Kimberley and Ladysmith in the British Natal and Cape Colonies.
Then it became real war. It had just been trouble brewing before that. And when the real war came, the Boers shut up, or they surrounded those towns and wanted to starve them out. Well, not being as highly civilized as we were, in their more rough way, when they got angry, they got a bit cruel.
Using their new siege guns, the Boers shelled the towns, hitting hospitals, killing women and children.
If British people are in trouble, the country's got to help them out. And if the British start a war, they've got to win.
This is the new Vauxhall Zafira. Thanks to Flex 7 technology, it has 39 different seat combinations. Number 1, 7 seats. Combinations number 2 and 3.
Number 14.
23. 38. Oh, is that the same as 11? No, I've done that one. There's one more in here somewhere. Kimber, where are you?
Vauxhall, raising the standard.
Now, Finish bring you a new dishwashing tablet with a built-in pre-soaker. Announcing Finish Powerball tabs with stain soakers. The only tablet with the power to get the cleanest results on the toughest dried-on egg. Because the Powerball softens and breaks it down, so the tab can clean to the most brilliant shine. Try new Finish Powerball tabs with stain soakers. Our ultimate finish.
This pack is your last chance to make sure your business is ready for the Millennium Bug. Look out for it.
Pilot G1.
Gel ink pens.
Serious style.
G1 gel ink pens from Pilot.
Its Latin name is Asteris rubens. The locals call it the Red Jewel. I take it with me everywhere because it reminds me of the best 2 weeks of my life. My mate Terry phoned me up. He said, "Got any dough? Got any holiday?" I said no to both. The thing is that don't matter to Terry. He said he could get us 2 weeks in Goa cheap if we left the next day. 24 hours later and I'm swimming with turtles. I sometimes need to get away to find out what's really important. That's why I'm going again next year.
Barclaycard. One card, a million uses.
To the Aboriginal people of Rubibi, Broome has always been a place of beauty. Many thousands of years later, the rest of us are finally catching on. Western Australia, holidays of an entirely different nature.
Fly Qantas to Perth, Western Australia from £569 return. To book or for a copy of Australia's brochure of the year, call Bridge the World 0845 30 40 200.
Lean on me when you're not strong, and I'll be your friend. I'll help you carry on, for it won't be long till I'm.
People have been relying on Royal Liver since 1850. That's why today, for savings, pensions and insurance, you can just lean on the Liver.
Buy your gas and electricity from British Gas, and you could be guaranteed cheaper electricity prices than your local supplier. Until 2002. A monster offer from British Gas. Call 0845 606 2002.
Goodbye, Dolly, I must leave you.
At 47,000 men, the British force wasn't huge, but they weren't expecting a huge war. Among the journalists was 24-year-old Winston Churchill. He was said to be both clever and bumptious. In command was General Sir Redvers Buller, VC, veteran of the Zulu War.
I hear the bugle calling. Goodbye, darling.
He was filmed boarding ship in a tall hat, shaking hands. He said he hoped he wouldn't be away long.
Goodbye, Dolly. Day.
At last we have arrived. We sighted land at 8 a.m. The harbour was crowded with great transports, crowded with soldiers. There were 5,000 while we were there, and I don't know how many horses. And the wharves and sheds are piled with boxes of ammunition, biscuits, stores and hay. In fact, you have no idea of Britain's greatness till you see a place like this. We had 5 miles to walk through Cape Town, and it fairly took the starch out of some of us.
From their open trucks, the ordinary soldiers, or Tommies, looked out at the strange land unfolding and wrote home about it. Corporal Harold Armstrong of the Kensingtons began to sense how hostile the environment was and how it favoured the Boers.
We're plagued by beetles, flies and fleas. Frightful country for marching. The hills bristle with mounds of stone which would afford splendid shelter for marksmen.
But at first, many officers treated the war as a hunting party. The Boers would be caught like pheasants in drives. Camouflage was unsporting. It would be a pushover, like wars they'd won against primitive tribesmen.
They didn't think that it was going to last very long. They knew that the Boers were virtually farmers without any military training or anything like that, and that there wouldn't be very much opposition. And as a result, when the army arrived in South Africa, according to what my father told me, there was very little reconnaissance. Very often, I remember him saying that several officers would get together and they'd say, see that copy over there? Let's go and see if there's any Boers up there. I tell you what, I'll race you there. And they'd charge off on their horses. And if the Boers happened to be there, well then, of course, they got casualties. And then they realized that there's more to the Boers than they'd thought.
Op burgers op na die oorlogsveld, so weer klink die woord. Toe sien jy net kommando's trek na oos, wes, suid en noord.
The Boer Republics mobilized over 30,000 men. They formed into commandos from each district. Sons joined with fathers. Whole families heeded the call to arms. Each man supplied his own horse and rifle.
Toe skree hulle vorentoe, vorentoe, hier kom die Engelse aan.
Die bedoeling was om die Britse garnisoene.
The idea was to defeat the British garrisons on the borders.
Met groot moed vertrek.
Many set out full of courage, with slogans on their hats, Cape Town or bust. Or cries like, we'll soon be eating bananas in Durban. The war will be over by Christmas. There was a feeling that a few quick victories and Britain will be willing to give us back our independence.
It was an army quite unlike the British. The Boers were bound by common cause, but not by discipline. The men elected their officers and didn't have to obey them.
The Boer is a strong individualist. Early in the war, an officer would often say, "Take that hill." He'd be talking to a commando of 150 men. Then 50 men would go and take the hill. The other 100 would go home, put their feet up, make coffee, cook a meal, saying, "We'll catch up with you later." It was quite clear in the beginning of the war. I will make war, but on my terms.
The Boers declared it a white man's war and promptly took their black servants with them. Perhaps 12,000 in all. Some went willingly. Others, like Paulie McQuenna's father, weren't given an option.
Basquas Ras was not a man who liked a black person telling him what to do. He wanted to be the one to tell the black man what to do. If he told you to go with him, you couldn't say no. My father took his boss's horse when it was tired and rested it. He had to remove the saddles and polish and prepare them. Where the boss went, he went. He had to carry his gun for him and follow him to the front where the fighting was. That's how Mr. Koosrats went to war.
The British agreed it was a white man's war, and then employed tens of thousands of blacks as ox drivers, labourers, scouts and spies.
My father joined the British forces because he could be paid. He didn't have that political affiliations one way or the other. The Boers didn't have the money to pay them. And the English had the money to pay them. And there were also supplies of food and all the rest of it. They were treated like soldiers, even though they were not soldiers.
6,000 miles from the war, 8-year-old Arthur Whitlock kept up with the British Army's progress across South Africa.
I was able to follow the war more closely because the Daily Mail, they brought out a map and you had little flags with pins on them and you pinned them showing the position of the various troops.
Arthur followed the movement of Lord Methuen with 8,000 men to relieve Kimberley and Mafeking, encircled by the Boers. General Buller, with 15,000, was off to relieve Ladysmith. But in their way stood the Boers, helped by the volunteer Irish Brigade. They leapt at the chance to strike a blow for the rights of small nations against the British oppressor. What they learned detonating railway lines in South Africa would later be put to use with the IRA. As well as blowing up bridges, the Boers ambushed trains, and armoured trains in particular. On the 15th of November 1899, Winston Churchill took a ride in one. The Guardian correspondent refused to go, saying Churchill would either see too little or too much. The Boers derailed the train here, at the foot of this hill.
My grandfather was the medical officer on the armoured train. During this derailment, they came under fire from the ridge west of the railway line, and the fire was pretty heavy, and they were wounded almost from the first. And Winston Churchill was on that armoured train. I can remember my grandfather saying that he remembered Winston Churchill turning to his batman and saying, Pass me my heavy revolver.
Churchill switched abruptly from journalist to leader of men. An intense fight followed, resulting in 4 dead, 14 wounded, and 58 taken prisoner, including Winston Churchill. And then, on his way to prison in Pretoria, Churchill was treated to a lecture by his Boer guard, which suddenly made him see why the Boers opposed them so bitterly. They feared that the British in victory would give full equal rights to the blacks.
Fancy letting the black filth walk on the pavement. Educate a Kaffir. Ah, that's you English all over. We educate them with a stick. They were put here by the God Almighty to work for us. Insist on their proper treatment, will you? We'll settle whether you English are to interfere with us before this war is over.
10th of December, 1899. British artillery pounded Boer positions in the hills around the besieged towns. Hills like Margesfontein near Kimberley. After the heavy bombardment, it showed no signs of Boer life. So 3,500 men of the Highland Brigade prepared to capture it. It was a night attack in a thunderstorm. There had been no reconnaissance. Near the foot of the hill, they were hit by a tremendous volley of bullets. Some were killed, others panicked and ran. Most stuck it out. For the whole of the next day, the Highlanders lay on the plain without shelter from long-range Mausers or baking sun. But where were the Boers shooting from? To answer that question, Lord Methuen ordered an aerial reconnoitre. While the battle raged below, Captain Jones went up to look for the enemy.
Filled balloon Titania made ascents for observing purposes for several hours. Saw Kimberley in the distance. But the Boer position was so well taken up that it was almost impossible to locate.
But Captain Jones was looking in the wrong place. The Boers weren't on the hill at all. They were secure in a trench at its foot. The trench is still there. A century ago, Michael Heffer's father, Louis, lay behind it, picking off the Highland Brigade. After a day of slaughter, a truce was called. Michael remembers his father's words.
I got
up and walked over to where the Scottish troops were lying. Some had up to 7 bullet holes through the head. I was very moved to see these young men. The reason was because there wasn't one old man there. They were all kids. My father saw an old Scottish minister walking amongst them, reading from a Bible. My father said it touched him deeply to see all the dead people, even though it was a big Boer victory.
There were over 900 British casualties. The Black Watch and Seaforths bore the brunt. One Highlander said they had been taken into a butcher's shop and left there. A private in the Black Watch dictated a poem from his hospital bed.
Why weren't we told of the trenches? Why weren't we told of the wire? Why attack in the quarter column? May Tommy Atkins inquire. Why were no scouts sent forward? Why were no scouts on our flank? Why were we marched up in column? Who made the mistake? Give his rank. Do they know his name in Old England? Do they know his incompetence yet? Tommy has learned to his sorrow, and Tommy will never forget.
The new Hoover Vortex with state-of-the-art triple vortex cleaning system. No bags, no filter replacement, no problems.
This pack is your last chance to make sure your business is ready for the Millennium Bug. Look out for it.
At Norwich Union, the feeling we get when our investments pay off, we've shared with generations of customers, whatever their dreams. Strength of Norwich Union. No one protects more.
Welcome to the land of ancient gods and golden pharaohs. Welcome to Alexander the Great and the legendary Cleopatra. Welcome to where Moses received the Ten Commandments and Jesus Christ found refuge. Welcome to rainbows under the sea and moonbeams over the Nile. Welcome to 7,000 years of astonishing history. Egypt, welcome to our 7th millennium.
Oh dear, inadequate car. Well, I think it's time you tried the new Nissan Primera.
When some horror blocks your plug holes, an ordinary liquid's only clean here, so blockages come back. You need new Mr. Muscle Foamer. Its special formula actually expands inside the pipe to help clear that horrible gunk that liquids leave behind, so pipes stay clear for longer. New Mr. Muscle Foamer unblocks plug holes like never before.
With the Woolwich, you can get an affordable new car. Simply choose any model, phone us, and we take care of the rest. There's a competitive rate of 9.9% APR. With delivery right to your door, Motorbase with the Woolwich. If you're without, ring 0845 607 1111.
Hello. Al? Oh, hi, Keith. All set for tomorrow? Yep, diddly-doo-dah. Taxi, 5:45. Paddington, 6:15. Heathrow, 6:45. Check-in at 7. Flight, 7:45. Arrive Manchester Airport at 9. Taxi, 9:20. Arrive city centre, 9:45. Do the meet at 10 and bam!
But wouldn't it be easier to grab a taxi and hop on the train with us?
Just how can you hope to reach my rung of the corporate ladder when all you're looking for is an easy life? Yeah.
Well, here's to the easy life.
From city centre to city centre, business brains take Virgin trains.
They called it Black Week in Britain. There had been 2 other defeats in 5 days, at Stormberg and Colenso.
I realised by the actual news in the paper that things weren't going too well. It was probably due to the lack of supplies and our fighting in an unknown country where those on the spot were very familiar with it. It was humiliating.
No one alive in 1899 could remember a time when the British had been beaten so resoundingly. A century of certainty overturned by a bunch of foreign farmers. Lord Wolseley, Commander-in-Chief of the British Army, was appalled.
We are face to face with a serious national crisis, and unless we meet it boldly, it will lead to dangerous complications with foreign powers.
But the foreigner's first instinct was to laugh. Queen Victoria had her own reply.
We are not interested in the possibilities of defeat.
But Boer response to trouncing Britain was strangely subdued.
Buitelandse vrywilligers is verstom dat die boere nie uitgelate is.
Foreign volunteers fighting with the Boers were astounded that the Boers were not elated about these victories. But it was just part of God's plan. We are good shots with the help of God. This slogan, with the help of God, almost became a philosophy of life. So they accepted the victories and all was well. We have no problems. Christmas is coming and we might have peace in the near future.
But there was no chance of peace. An atmosphere of defiant jingoism now ruled in Britain. While Queen Victoria cheered up the soldiers already in South Africa with a tin of chocolates each for Christmas, Lord Wolseley decided to double the army. The Imperial Volunteers were formed, with gentlemen for the first time serving in the ranks. People now spoke of it as a national war. And after the failures of Buller and Methuen, new leaders were called for. Enter Field Marshal Lord Roberts of Kandahar and Lord Kitchener of Khartoum himself.
I remember they used to sing a song. Lord Roberts and Kitchener, General Buller and White, 4 of the bravest generals that ever went out to fight. And then it went on. And when the war is over, how happy we'll be, for I love Rosie O'Grady, and Rosie O'Grady loves me.
On the 10th of January 1900, Roberts landed in Cape Town as Commander-in-Chief, over General Buller. In contrast with the patriotic optimism back home, Roberts had deep misgivings about the campaign. His only son Freddie had just been killed during Buller's failed bid to relieve Ladysmith. Buller was now just 16 miles from Ladysmith. Wary of chalking up another defeat, he put General Warren in temporary command. In between Warren and Ladysmith was a formidable range of hills. British mounted infantry scouting on the left flank stumbled on a clear route round the hills to Ladysmith. This would have averted the bloodiest battle of the whole war. But the British Army of 1900 was no place for initiative. Warren ordered these men back and decided to force straight through the hills. That meant capturing Spion Kop, the same vantage point from which the Voortrekkers had looked out 60 years before. One of the officers taking part in the operation was Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Thornycroft. It was to be a surprise attack at night up this valley to Spion Kop beyond. But Thornycroft realized they would get hopelessly lost in the darkness. So he sat here at dusk and, noting the landmarks ahead, drew a sketch map to guide them. A century on, Thornycroft's family brings a copy of the map back to Spion Kop.
That is the expert. Right. Yes. And it's wonderful.
They show it to their guide, Gilbert Torlage.
There was a sandstone shelf down the side here, which is visible.
Isn't it?
Huh. Still there.
The map enabled the assault force of 1,700 men to make their way up Spion Kop.
Pitch dark night, but how many Boers are here? Have they got artillery with them? No one knows. Orders were that they were to be absolutely silent. No talking, no smoking, no lights, no firing. And slowly, 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 they made their way up that spur.
Private Matthew Kelly recalled the lengths they went to ensure silence.
All the dogs which are following us are destroyed. After marching for 2 or 3 hours, we are told quietly that we have passed the enemy sentries and are in their lines.
Spion Kop itself was in fact only lightly guarded by the Boers. But they had reinforcements, including artillery, close at hand. And the British, having failed to reconnoitre Spion Kop, didn't know that just beyond it lay a semicircle of hills, perfect positions for the Boers to bombard Spion Kop itself. A little after 3 in the morning, the British reached the grassy plateau which rises gradually to form the summit.
Probably when they were somewhere in this area, suddenly out of the darkness came a tremendous challenge of "Beast ah!" Getting no response, the Boers opened fire, the British charge forward, and they catch one of those Boers, bayonet him and kill him. The rest of the Boers run away, and with that the British then gave 3 hurrahs to indicate to everybody that Spion Kop had fallen into British hands.
The British now dug themselves in. This row of stones marks the line of the trench. But the ground was rocky, and many picks and shovels had been abandoned on the long walk up. The trench was barely 18 inches deep. Enveloped in fog, the exhausted soldiers now snatched some rest. It wasn't until dawn that they realized just how dangerously close the Boer front line was.
About 7 a.m. the sun breaks through the clouds and we see a long grassy ridge about 1,000 yards in front, but commanding our ridge. About 8 a.m. the Boers open a terrific fire from every place except our extreme rear. We take the best cover we can get. Captain Birch gets shot in the head just above the eye. The fire is terrible, ever so much heavier than what I had seen before or since.
Boer reinforcements now hurried up this slope behind the Boer lines. One of the newcomers was 17-year-old Deneys Rates. Deneys wrote an account of his war, which has been translated by his grandson Michael.
The mountain rose above us, as steep as a wall, and it was no easy climb, passing a trail of corpses on the way. Halfway to the top, I found Robbie Reinicker lying dead. When I reached the top of Spion Kop, I discovered that the burghers had advanced no further than the first line of rocks, right on the rim of the plateau, and that the rest of the flat summit was still in the hands of the enemy. The nearest English were behind a long, low stone wall, no more than 30 yards away, from where they kept up a vicious fire on us with their Lee Metfords.
The Boers now used a signaller on Spion Kop to direct their artillery fire precisely onto the British trench. The accuracy of the Boer gunners was devastating. Around 9 in the morning, General Woodgate, the British officer commanding Spion Kop, was mortally wounded. A doom-laden message was sent by heliograph.
Reinforce at once, or all lost. General dead.
General Buller sensed the rising panic and sent an order to Warren.
Unless you put some really good, hard fighting men in command on the top, you will lose the hill. I suggest Thornycroft.
But it took hours for the message to reach Thornycroft, pinned down in this trench. No one knew who was in command, and the situation was deteriorating.
By about 1 o'clock, the suffering, the losses was awful. It was hot, hot, hot. People were thirsty, people were tired, and there were still many, many hours of daylight ahead. Behind here lay many dead, many wounded, and there was no end in sight.
This was a fatal Spion Kop, and the sun pouring down. The shells dropping everywhere. You could see the poor chap shot down like skittle pins.
The most awful scene of carnage. Men blown to atoms, joints torn asunder, headless bodies, trunks of bodies. Awful, awful.
Copy of letter from Colonel Thornycroft, Spion Kop, to Sir Charles Warren, 2:30 p.m, 24th of January 1900. We are badly in need of water. There are many killed and wounded. If you really wish to make a certainty of the hill for the night, you must send more infantry and attack enemy's guns.
But General Warren, 2 miles away in his camp, had no idea where exactly on Spion Kop his troops were. Fearing the British might get hit by their own artillery, he did not shell the enemy's guns. For their part, the Boers on Spion Kop were under such intense fire from Thornycroft's men that, ironically, they too felt they were losing the battle.
The original burghers, who had attacked early that morning, were holding on to the barren rock perimeter, all the while in the burning sun, under severe fire and unable to advance further. As a result, their courage started to weaken, and imperceptibly, many began to slip down the hill.
Meanwhile, relentless Boer artillery destroyed the British signalling position here, smashing the heliograph. No one had remembered to bring oil for the signal lamp. Thornycroft felt increasingly abandoned, while the generals dithered below. By sunset, the British were on their last legs.
Regret to report that I have been obliged to abandon Spion Kop, as the position has become untenable. I have withdrawn the troops in regular order and will come to report as soon as possible. Alex Thornycroft, Lieutenant Colonel.
So he had taken an awesome responsibility. But I think he really had very little option.
He knew he was going to get criticised because he wrote to his brother.
That's why that is.
And he said, I'm writing this letter in case anything happens to me, so that you'll know exactly what happens. And he goes through all the reasons why he decided to do it.
Yeah.
So he knew he was going to get fragged.
Mm.
As darkness fell, the British and Boers retreated down their sides of the hill, each believing the battle lost. But one man was actually climbing Spion Kop. Winston Churchill had daringly escaped from prison and joined the army. He was sent up